Surgeons operated without anesthesia during World War II, and you won't believe patients survived. June 7, 1944, Normandy, France. Canvas hospital tent. Dr. Truett Jernigan stares down at Private Robert Wright, a paratrooper with his abdomen torn open by German shrapnel. The surgical tray sits empty, no morphine, no ether, not even chloroform. For 48 hours, supply convoys have failed to reach the beaches. Wright looks up at the surgeon, jaw clenched, knowing what comes next. A leather strap gets forced between his teeth. Around them, hundreds of wounded men scream and groan. But here's what nobody tells you about D-Day. This wasn't just one desperate surgery. This was happening in 1,000 tents across Normandy that week. Yet somehow, impossibly, 96% of these soldiers survived. How did American medicine turn agony into victory? What industrial machine made survival without painkillers not just possible, but routine? And why did this single innovation doom the German war effort before the first tank rolled off the beaches? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The canvas walls of the 45th Evacuation Hospital billowed under a damp wind that carried the smell of cordite and death from the beaches. Dr. Truett Jernigan's gloved hands hovered over the abdomen of Private Robert Wright, a paratrooper whose body had been torn open by German shrapnel at Sainte-Mère-Église. The surgical tray beside him told a story of desperation. No morphine, no ether, not even chloroform remained. For 48 hours, supply convoys had failed to reach the Norman beaches. Ammunition and fuel took priority. Medicine lagged behind in the brutal calculus of war. Wright stared up at the surgeon, his jaw set in grim determination. A leather strap was forced between his teeth, the only barrier against the agony to come. Around them, the symphony of war's aftermath played out in groans, shouted orders, and the wet sounds of emergency surgery. The tent itself shook with each artillery round that thundered in the distance, a reminder that the battle for France had only just begun. Jernigan had trained at Johns Hopkins, where sterile operating theaters and abundant anesthesia were simply facts of medical life. No textbook had prepared him for this moment, to cut a man open while he remained fully conscious, to probe for shrapnel while the patient bit down on leather to keep from screaming. But delay meant death. Internal bleeding would not wait for supply ships to brave the Channel crossing. He nodded to his nurses, women who had volunteered for this horror because someone had to bear witness to courage. The scalpel descended. Wright's muffled scream merged with the rumble of distant guns, and in that moment, the foundation of America's medical machine became visible, not in comfort or abundance, but in the promise that relief was only a supply convoy away. The 45th Evacuation Hospital could deploy anywhere in the world within hours, complete with 400 beds, 12 surgical tables, and steam sterilizers. Even without morphine, they had tools no German medic could dream of. Wright would survive this operation, as would thousands like him across Normandy that terrible week. His survival would depend not on luck or prayer, but on America's unprecedented capacity to deliver healing across an ocean. At the exact hour, Dr. Jernigan cut into Private Wright. Steve Dora's 3,000 miles away in Brooklyn and Boston were loading wooden crates marked plasma. Human, do not freeze, onto Liberty ships bound for France. Each glass bottle contained the distilled essence of American industrial genius, human blood transformed into a commodity that could cross an ocean intact and save lives on foreign soil. The American Red Cross had pioneered large-scale plasma collection in 1940, 4 years before the first American boot touched Norman sand. What began as an experimental program had evolved into a vast civilian effort that turned living rooms in Des Moines and church basements in Detroit into collection centers. Housewives, students, and factory workers rolled up their sleeves not for money, but because their blood could become part of the arsenal of democracy. By D-Day, 2.3 million pints of plasma had been shipped overseas. Unlike whole blood, which spoiled within days and required precise type matching, plasma was practically indestructible. It could survive weeks in transport, required no refrigeration, and worked for any patient regardless of blood type. The milky yellow fluid that dripped into Wright's veins represented the collective circulation of a nation mobilized for war. The contrast with German medical supply was stark and decisive. The Wehrmacht relied on whole blood donations collected near the front lines, often spoiling before reaching field hospitals. German medics watched soldiers bleed to death not from lack of skill, but from absence of the industrial infrastructure that made American medicine possible. While German hospitals rationed blood by the drop, American plasma reached Normandy hospitals within 72 hours of the first landings. The glass bottles themselves told the story of American manufacturing supremacy. Produced in pharmaceutical plants from New Jersey to California, each container was standardized, sterile, and labeled with precision that would have impressed any German engineer. Rubber tubing, metal clamps, and graduated measuring devices turned blood donation into an assembly line process that could scale to meet any demand. Behind every pint that saved an American, life was an ordinary citizen whose veins had become part of the war effort. A secretary in Boston whose afternoon donation would keep a tanker alive in the Ardennes. A farmer in Kansas whose blood would flow through a Marine's arteries on Iwo Jima. An assembly line worker in Detroit whose plasma would buy precious time for a flight crew shot. Down over Germany, as Wright stabilized under the steady drip of donated plasma, he became living proof that American industrial capacity could transform the most basic human need, blood, into a weapon of war. The bottle tilted slightly in its stand, golden light catching its surface, as lifeblood became strategic supply. Across the battle lines that carved France into zones of liberation and occupation, German medic Dr. Ernst Gattermann worked in the cellar ruins of Aachen, his makeshift hospital lit by flickering lanterns that threw dancing shadows on walls blackened by Allied bombing. On his wooden operating table lay a Wehrmacht infantryman, his leg shattered by American artillery, bone fragments visible through torn flesh that would never heal properly again. Gattermann reached for a half-empty bottle of chloroform, its contents diminished and potency uncertain after weeks of careful rationing. No ether remained. No morphine had reached his station in days. The saw beside him was blunt from repeated use, its teeth bent and scarred from operations performed on kitchen tables and cellar floors throughout the dying city. He would have to sharpen it again on a brick wall before beginning the amputation that would save this boy's life. If life was what you called existence, with one leg in a collapsing empire. German medical officers had once rivaled the world's finest. Gattermann himself had trained in Berlin, where precision surgery and pharmaceutical excellence were sources of national pride. But by autumn 1944, the Third Reich was collapsing under the weight of strategic bombing and relentless blockade. Rail lines that should have carried medical supplies instead lay twisted under the rubble of bombed bridges. Supply depots that once held mountains of bandages and medicines now existed only as smoking craters. The numbers told a story of systematic medical collapse. Mortality rates in German field hospitals had climbed to 25%, nearly double the American figure, not because German surgeons lacked skill, but because they lacked everything else. Soldiers bled to death waiting for evacuations that never came. Infections that penicillin could cure became death sentences. Simple wounds that American medics treated with sulfa powder and bandages became gangrenous amputations in German hands. Gattermann's journal, kept hidden beneath floorboards, recorded the steady degradation of medical care. September 15th, no morphine for 3 days. Used last ether on chest wound. October 3rd, sterilizer broken, boiling instruments in pots. October 20th, amputating with kitchen knives. No proper saws. Each entry documented not just scarcity, but the systematic destruction of Germany's capacity to heal its wounded. The contrast was visible in every detail. While American evacuation hospitals could be deployed with 400 beds and full surgical suites, Gattermann operated in a basement with equipment scavenged from bombed pharmacies. While American wounded received plasma within hours, German soldiers died from shock that simple blood replacement could have prevented. While American medics distributed sulfa powder freely, German doctors hoarded aspirin like precious metals. as Gatorman prepared to amputate another leg, sharpening his saw against the brick wall of his ruined hospital. Sparks flew against stone in a shower that captured the essence of a nation, burning itself out. The scraping sound echoed through the cellar, a grinding reminder that the Reich's capacity to wage war was being worn away, not just by bullets and bombs, but by bandages it could no longer provide. French nurse Geneviève de Galard had trained in the civilian hospitals of Toulouse, where order and routine defined medical care. Nothing in her education had prepared her for the chaos that engulfed Normandy in the weeks following D-Day, when every barn, church, and schoolhouse became an impromptu hospital for the flood of wounded that poured back from the front lines. She found herself working 18-hour shifts in a converted cathedral, its stone floors now covered with American cots arranged in neat rows that stretched from altar to nave. The wounded came in waves: American paratroopers with shrapnel wounds, German prisoners with infected bullet holes, French civilians caught in artillery crossfire. All human suffering looked the same under the stained glass windows that had witnessed centuries of prayer. What amazed Geneviève was not the volume of casualties, but the abundance that arrived with the American wounded. Each ambulance that pulled up to the cathedral doors brought not just soldiers, but crates of medical supplies that seemed impossible in a Europe starved by 4 years of war. Plasma bottles by the dozen, bandages so white and clean they seemed to glow, sulfa powder in quantities that French hospitals had not seen since 1940. She watched American medics distribute these supplies freely, not just to their own wounded, but to German prisoners and French civilians as well. A Wehrmacht soldier with an infected arm wound received the same penicillin injection as the American sergeant lying beside him. French children injured by artillery received plasma that had traveled 3,000 miles from American blood banks. The generosity seemed otherworldly to Europeans, accustomed to rationing every aspirin tablet. The cathedral that served as their hospital was meant for 200 patients, but swelled to 800 within days. Farmers' barns became overflow wards. Church pews were removed to make room for surgical tables. The local priest's quarters became a pharmacy stocked with medicines that most French doctors had forgotten existed, Geneviève wrote in her diary. The Americans brought the sky with them. She meant the constant drone of C-47 transport planes that circled overhead, dropping supply canisters whenever ground convoys failed to get through. Watching those parachutes drift down, carrying bandages, plasma, and antibiotics like manna from heaven, she understood that this war would be won not just by superior firepower, but by superior capacity to heal. The contrast was stark when German wounded arrived. Their uniforms were patched and repatched. Their medical kits contained aspirin and cloth bandages, nothing more. Their medics carried leather satchels that would have seemed primitive to American corpsmen. Most telling of all, German wounded arrived alone. No supply convoys followed them. No aircraft dropped medical supplies for their care. As another C-47 circled overhead and supply parachutes began drifting down toward the cathedral, Geneviève looked skyward with wonder. Each falling crate represented American industrial capacity, translated into mercy, democracy's promise that abundance could defeat scarcity, that a nation's wealth could be measured not just in tanks and bombers, but in its capacity to heal. While surgeons like Dr. Jernigan fought infection and blood loss in Normandy field hospitals, an industrial transformation was taking place 3,000 miles away in the factories of Detroit, Brooklyn, and Chicago. Assembly lines that had churned out Buicks and Frigidaires now stamped out surgical clamps and sterilizing equipment. Women who had sewn wedding dresses now stitched sterile surgical gowns. The entire American manufacturing system had pivoted to mass-produce Mercy, the War Department's medical victory program, launched in 1943 with an unprecedented budget of $1.5 billion, represented industrial mobilization on a scale that defied comprehension. Monthly production figures read like the output of entire national economies: 4 million bandages, 200,000 surgical kits, 50,000 gallons of ether. These were not the desperate improvisations of a nation at war, but the calculated application of American mass production techniques to the business of saving lives. In a converted automobile plant outside Detroit, women in white coats worked 12-hour shifts filling plasma collection kits. Each kit contained precisely measured components, glass bottles tested for stress fractures, rubber tubing cut to exact specifications, sterile needles individually wrapped and inspected. The same quality control standards that had made American cars the envy of the world now ensured that every medical supply reaching the front lines met hospital-grade specifications. The numbers themselves told the story of American industrial supremacy. By 1944, American factories were producing more medical supplies in a single month than Germany manufactured in an entire year. A single pharmaceutical plant in New Jersey could output more penicillin in 1 week than all German factories combined could produce in 6 months. The typing pool at the Ford Motor Company had been retrained to assemble surgical instrument sets with assembly line precision. This was not merely abundance, it was abundance weaponized. Every bandage produced in excess of American needs could be shipped to Allies. Every extra bottle of plasma represented a British or Soviet soldier who might survive wounds that would have killed him in any previous war. Medical supply had become a form of economic warfare, demonstrating democracy's capacity to outproduce totalitarian systems, not just in tanks and aircraft, but in the basic tools of human survival. The women who worked these medical assembly lines understood their role in the war effort. Each plasma kit they filled might save a brother in the Pacific. Each surgical clamp they assembled could help a surgeon in Italy remove shrapnel from a wounded tanker. Their factory floors had become theaters of war where the weapons were bandages and the ammunition was antibiotics, as another wooden crate marked U.S. Army Medical Department was sealed and loaded onto a truck bound for the docks. It carried with it the concentrated power of American industrial democracy. Inside were supplies that would keep fighting men alive, and alive men could win wars. The lid slammed shut with the finality of a nation that had chosen to save as efficiently as it destroyed. General Dwight D. Eisenhower received daily casualty reports from all sectors of the European theater, thick manila folders that documented the human cost of liberation in precise military language. What startled him in the summer of 1944 was not the number of wounded. Heavy fighting inevitably produced heavy casualties, but the staggering percentage of those wounded who returned to life. 96% of American soldiers who reached field hospitals survived their wounds. The figure seemed impossible, a statistical anomaly that required verification. Eisenhower had lived through the Great War, where survival rates hovered around 70% on good days. The leap was so dramatic that he initially suspected clerical errors in the reporting, but the numbers were accurate, verified by medical officers across the theater. The American military medical system had achieved something unprecedented in the history of warfare. It had made survival from combat wounds the statistical norm rather than the exception. Wounds that would have been fatal in 1918, abdominal penetrations, chest trauma, severe burns, were now routinely survivable with proper treatment. The revolution had multiple causes. Plasma replacement therapy prevented shock deaths that had claimed thousands in previous wars. Sulfa drugs and the new miracle antibiotic penicillin stopped infections that once turned simple wounds into death sentences. Rapid evacuation systems meant that soldiers reached surgical care within hours rather than days. But underlying all these advances was American industrial capacity, the ability to deliver medical miracles to every corner of a global battlefield. To Eisenhower, these survival statistics represented more than medical progress. They were a force multiplier of unprecedented strategic importance. Every soldier saved was another rifle on the line, another veteran whose combat experience could train replacements. Divisions that should have been bled white by months of combat instead maintained near full strength through the constant return of healed. Wounded, the implications extended beyond individual battles to the grand strategy of the war itself. American units could sustain offensive operations indefinitely because their manpower losses were constantly replenished by medical miracles. German divisions, by contrast, never recovered their wounded. Each casualty was permanent, irreplaceable. Over time, this disparity in medical capability would prove as decisive as any technological advantage in tanks or aircraft. Eisenhower understood that he was witnessing a transformation in the nature of warfare itself. For the first time in human history, a nation's capacity to heal had become as important as its capacity to destroy. The American medical system was not just saving lives, it was winning wars by ensuring that democratic soldiers could fight, survive, and fight again. As he set down the latest casualty report, Eisenhower murmured to his aide, "They're sending them back to us faster than we can count them." It was an observation that would reshape military medicine for generations to come. America had weaponized mercy, and that weapon would prove decisive in the struggle between democracy and tyranny. Private Robert Wright took his first tentative steps across the hospital tent floor 6 weeks after Dr. Jernigan had cut into his abdomen without anesthesia. The surgery that should have ended his war had instead become the beginning of his recovery, part of an American medical machine designed not just to save lives, but to return soldiers to combat as quickly as possible. Wright was one of hundreds of thousands who benefited from the U.S. military's rapid rehabilitation system. Minor wounds received immediate treatment and quick return to duty. More serious injuries went through specialized recovery centers where physical therapy, occupational training, and psychological support combined to restore fighting capability. The goal was not merely survival, but complete restoration of combat effectiveness. The statistics were staggering. 70% of American wounded returned to duty within 90 days. This was not a happy accident, but the result of systematic medical planning that treated wounded soldiers as valuable military assets to be repaired and returned to service. Specialized hospitals near the front lines focused on rapid treatment of minor wounds. Evacuation hospitals like the 45th provided emergency surgery to stabilize serious cases. Base hospitals in England and the United States handled long-term rehabilitation. The contrast with German medical practice was stark and strategically decisive. Wehrmacht wounded who survived their initial treatment rarely returned to frontline units. Germany's medical system, overwhelmed by casualties and starved of supplies, focused on basic survival rather than restoration of combat capability. German soldiers recovered in civilian hospitals far from the front, often reassigned to rear area duties or discharged entirely. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. This difference in medical philosophy had profound implications for combat effectiveness. American divisions maintained their strength through constant infusion of recovered wounded, experienced soldiers who knew their weapons, understood tactics, and could train replacements. German units, by contrast, dwindled steadily as casualties mounted, their ranks filled with undertrained recruits who lacked combat experience. Wright's return to his unit represented a small miracle multiplied across thousands of cases. The paratrooper who had nearly died from shrapnel wounds was now ready to jump again, his combat experience intact and his determination strengthened by survival. His medical records showed the efficiency of American battlefield medicine. Wounded June 7th, surgery June 7th, evacuation to England June 9th, returned to unit August 15th. The sound of boots hitting the ground as recovered soldiers rejoined their companies became the rhythm of American victory. Each man represented not just individual courage, but the industrial and medical systems that made his recovery possible. They were walking proof that American democracy could afford to save its soldiers because American industry could afford to heal them. As Wright strapped on his parachute for his next combat jump, he carried with him the collective investment of American medical science. His survival was not luck. It was the product of a nation that had chosen to measure victory not just in enemies killed, but in Americans kept alive. The engines of a C-47 Skytrain roared to life on a hastily constructed airstrip carved from a Norman meadow, its cargo bay loaded not with paratroopers or supplies, but with wounded soldiers bound for hospitals in England. For the first time in military history, air evacuation had become systematic, reliable, and vast in scale, a flying lifeline that connected every battlefield to the most advanced medical care in the world. Flight Nurse Lieutenant Mary Johnson checked the plasma drips of 6 wounded men, strapped to canvas stretchers along the aircraft's walls. Each patient had been stabilized at a field hospital, but required surgery beyond what frontline facilities could provide. In previous wars, these soldiers would have bounced in horse-drawn ambulances for days, many dying from shock and infection during transport. Now they would reach a fully equipped base hospital in England within hours. The systematic use of aircraft for medical evacuation represented another application of American industrial and organizational superiority. The Army Air Forces had dedicated entire squadrons of C-47s to medical transport, complete with specialized loading equipment, onboard medical gear, and trained flight nurses. Each aircraft could carry 6 stretcher cases or 12 walking wounded, and flights operated around the clock when weather permitted. Geneviève de Galard watched from the ground as another C-47 lifted off, disappearing into the gray Channel sky with its cargo of wounded Americans. She had seen enough conventional evacuations to appreciate the miracle of flight. Medicine, men who would have died during ground transport were now whisked away to surgical theaters that rivaled anything in civilian medicine. The contrast with German evacuation methods highlighted the growing disparity in military capability. Wehrmacht wounded were transported in horse-drawn carts or on foot when fuel ran short. German hospitals had no air ambulance service, no systematic evacuation network. Wounded German soldiers often took weeks to reach proper medical care, if they reached it at all. By war's end, American air evacuation flights had transported over 1 million wounded soldiers, more patients than most national health services handled in peacetime. The C-47s became symbols of American reach and capability, aircraft that could deliver supplies to any battlefield and evacuate casualties from any front line. Their constant presence overhead reminded both allies and enemies that American logistics could overcome any obstacle. The success of air evacuation also demonstrated the integration of American military systems. Fighter escorts protected medical flights. Ground controllers coordinated takeoffs and landings. Weather services provided routing information. Maintenance crews kept aircraft operational. The entire system functioned with the precision of American industrial management, applied to the problem of saving lives, as the C-47, carrying Wright and 5 other wounded. Soldiers faded into the clouds over the English Channel. It carried with it proof that American power extended beyond bombers and battleships to include the compassionate application of technology to human suffering. The aircraft's engines became the sound of democracy in action, loud, powerful, and dedicated to bringing its soldiers home alive. Dr. Ernst Gadermann sat in his cellar hospital in Aachen, surrounded by the dim glow of kerosene lamps and the moans of wounded German soldiers who would never see home again. His diary entry for November 15, 1944, captured the despair of a medical system collapsing under the weight of strategic defeat. We are bleeding to death, not from enemy bullets, but from our inability to stop the bleeding. The numbers in Gadermann's daily reports told a story of systematic medical failure. His division had suffered 800 casualties in October, but only 50 had returned to combat duty. The rest were dead, permanently disabled, or lost in the chaos of retreat. Meanwhile, intelligence reports indicated that American divisions facing his sector had returned over 300 men to combat in the same period. Despite suffering similar casualty levels, German staff officers began to understand that they were losing a war of attrition they could not win. Each American soldier saved was a rifle that would fire again. Each German soldier lost was gone forever. The mathematics of survival had become as important as the mathematics of firepower, and Germany was losing both equations simultaneously. The strategic implications were staggering. American divisions could sustain offensive operations indefinitely because their strength was constantly renewed by recovered wounded. German divisions, by contrast, dwindled into skeleton formations that existed only on paper. A Wehrmacht regiment that started the war with 3,000 men might field 300 effective soldiers after 6 months of combat, with no prospect of reinforcement from recovered casualties. Gotterman witnessed this degradation firsthand. Soldiers arrived at his hospital with wounds that American medics could treat routinely, but which became death sentences in German hands. Simple infections spread unchecked without antibiotics. Shock killed men who could have been saved with plasma. Burns became gangrenous without proper dressings. His hospital had become a charnel house where good men died from treatable conditions. The contrast in medical capability reflected broader differences in national power. American industry could produce unlimited quantities of medical supplies because American factories were safe from bombing. American hospitals operated with full electricity and clean water because American infrastructure remained intact. American wounded reached care quickly because American logistics systems functioned efficiently. German medical records from this period read like documentation of a slow-motion catastrophe. Field hospitals reported critical shortages of everything from bandages to aspirin. Evacuation routes were constantly disrupted by Allied bombing. Medical personnel were reassigned to combat units as manpower shortages became critical. The entire system was cannibalizing itself to survive. As Gotterman wrote his final entry in the diary, he would soon abandon during the retreat from Aachen. His words captured the essence of medical warfare. The enemy has not just outfought us, they have outhealed us. Their wounded return as ours die. Their strength grows as ours fades. This is how empires fall, not in one great battle, but in the slow hemorrhage of irreplaceable men. In the months following Germany's surrender, military historians and medical officers began compiling statistics that would astound the world and redefine understanding of modern warfare. The ledger of American medical achievement in World War II contained numbers that seemed to defy belief. Over 600,000 American wounded treated in the European theater alone, with survival rates that exceeded 96% for those reaching medical care. The scope of the American medical effort dwarfed entire national health systems. 700,000 medical personnel had served overseas, more than the peacetime populations of most European cities. Mobile hospitals had been deployed to every theater of war, carrying American medical standards to battlefield from Alaska to Australia. The logistics required to maintain this medical empire, shipping millions of tons of supplies across multiple oceans, represented an organizational achievement without precedent in human history. Dr. Henry Beecher, a Harvard anesthesiologist who had served in North Africa and Italy, published the first comprehensive analysis of American battlefield medicine in 1946. His findings revealed that the United States had not merely improved on existing medical practices, it had revolutionized the entire concept of military medicine. The integration of industrial production, scientific research, and systematic organization had created a medical machine that treated wounded soldiers as efficiently as Detroit assembled automobiles. The international comparisons were stark and revealing. Soviet medical services, despite treating far more casualties, achieved survival rates barely exceeding 70%. German medical records, where they survived the war, showed even lower figures. British medical services, though competent and well-trained, lacked the industrial backing that made American medical abundance possible. What impressed international observers was not just American medical efficiency, but its democratic character. The same system that saved American soldiers extended care to prisoners of war, Allied wounded, and civilian casualties. German POWs in American custody received better medical care than German soldiers in Wehrmacht hospitals. This was not merely humanitarian gesture, it was demonstration of systemic superiority, proof that democratic abundance could afford generosity even toward enemies. The revolution in military medicine also revealed the broader transformation of American society during the war. A nation that had struggled through economic depression had emerged as a global medical superpower, capable of delivering advanced surgical care to any point on Earth. The same industrial capacity that produced tanks and bombers could be retooled to mass-produce mercy. The statistical summary prepared for President Truman contained figures that captured the magnitude of American achievement. 16 million Americans had served in the armed forces. 12 million had received some form of medical treatment, and survival rates had reached levels unimaginable in any previous conflict. These numbers represented more than medical progress. They documented the emergence of a new form of national power based on the capacity to preserve rather than destroy. As the final reports were filed and the last hospitals converted back to civilian use, one statistic stood out above all others: 96% survival. It was a number that would define American military medicine for generations to come. The Mobile Army Surgical Hospital that Lieutenant Colonel Frank Jobe established outside, sold in 1951, was a direct descendant of the canvas hospitals that had saved lives in Normandy 7 years earlier. The same principles applied: rapid triage, immediate surgery, quick evacuation. But the tools had evolved, incorporating lessons learned from millions of cases treated during World War II. Helicopter evacuation had replaced the horse-drawn ambulances that still served many armies. Bell H-13 helicopters could reach wounded Marines in 30 minutes, compared to the hours or days required for ground transport. The golden hour concept, getting wounded soldiers to surgical care within 60 minutes, had become military doctrine, though the phrase itself would not be coined for another decade. Private First Class James Wilson, wounded by Chinese artillery near the Chosin Reservoir, received blood plasma developed from techniques perfected during World War II. The plasma that saved his life was virtually identical to the fluid that had kept Robert Wright alive on D-Day, proof that wartime medical innovations had become permanent fixtures of American military medicine. Penicillin, still considered a miracle drug in 1945, was now standard issue for every American medic. Sulfa drugs, once rationed carefully, were distributed freely to treat everything from infected wounds to pneumonia. The antibiotics that had given American forces decisive medical advantages in World War II were now taken for granted, but their impact remained revolutionary. The civilian medical system had also been transformed by wartime innovations. Plasma banks established during the war now served every major American hospital. Trauma surgery techniques developed in field hospitals had revolutionized emergency medicine. The systematic approach to mass casualties, refined during the London Blitz and Normandy invasion, became standard procedure for disaster response. Dr. Truett Jernigan, now chief of surgery at a Veterans Administration hospital in Tennessee, watched these developments with professional satisfaction. The desperate improvisation of D-Day had evolved into systematic excellence. Young surgeons trained on techniques he had pioneered while operating without anesthesia in Norman hospitals. The legacy of those terrible hours when morphine ran short was a generation of medical practitioners who understood that American medicine could overcome any challenge. Of the statistical revolution continued into the Korean conflict. Survival rates that had amazed observers in World War II became baseline expectations. Mobile hospitals processed casualties with assembly line efficiency while maintaining surgical standards that exceeded most civilian facilities. The integration of helicopter evacuation reduced time from wound to surgery to levels that would have seemed impossible. In 1944, as a helicopter lifted Corporal Michael Thompson away from a frozen Korean hillside toward the Somme, waiting surgical team at the 8076th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, the sound of its rotors carried echoes of C-47 engines over Normandy. The technology had advanced, but the principle remained constant. American military medicine would spare no expense and accept no limitation in its mission to keep fighting men alive. 50 years after D-Day, Robert Wright returned to Omaha Beach as an old man, his steps slower, but his memory sharp. The scar across his abdomen, hidden beneath his shirt, served as permanent reminder of the morning when Dr. Jernigan had operated without anesthesia while German artillery rumbled in the distance. Standing among the white crosses of the American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, Wright touched names of comrades who had not been as fortunate. The numbers carved in marble told only part of the story. 9,400 American soldiers buried in Norman soil, each cross representing a family's loss and a nation's sacrifice. But Wright knew other numbers, figures less visible but equally important, the hundreds of thousands who had been saved, patched up, and sent home to wives and children they might never have seen again. His own survival was not unique. It was representative of a medical revolution that had transformed the nature of warfare itself. America had not simply outfought its enemies, it had out-healed them, creating a medical-industrial complex that could save lives as efficiently as its military-industrial complex could take them. The same organizational genius that mass-produced bombers and battleships had been applied to the mass production of mercy. The contrast with German capabilities had been decisive in ways that few historians fully appreciated. While German divisions bled to death from irreplaceable losses, American units maintained strength through constant return of recovered wounded. Medical superiority had become as important as technological superiority in determining the war's outcome. Wright walked among the graves thinking of Dr. Jernigan's steady hands and the plasmas that had dripped into his veins. Behind his individual survival lay the collective effort of millions. The women who had donated blood in American cities, the factory workers who had produced medical supplies, the pilots who had flown evacuation missions, the nurses who had tended wounds with supplies that seemed unlimited to Europeans accustomed to scarcity. The memorial walls contained names of battles, Normandy, St. Vith, Hurtgen Forest, but they did not record the parallel battle fought in field hospitals and evacuation centers. For every soldier who died fighting, 5 had been saved by American medical miracles. That ratio had proved as decisive as any technological advantage in tanks or aircraft. Standing at the cliff's edge where Allied forces had first gained their foothold in Europe, Wright listened to waves breaking against the sand below. Each wave carried echoes of that terrible morning when survival had depended not on luck or prayer, but on America's unprecedented capacity to deliver healing across an ocean. The scars on his body were proof that American democracy had chosen to save as fiercely as it fought, measuring victory not just in enemies defeated, but in Americans brought home alive. The final tally was inscribed not in marble, but in the lives that continued beyond the war's end, men and women who raised families, built careers, and contributed to a society that had invested so heavily in their survival. Wright's grandson served as a Navy medical corpsman, carrying forward a tradition that traced its lineage to Norman beaches, where American medicine had first proved that democracy's abundance could overcome tyranny's scarcity. If you enjoyed the story, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it